Hi, folks, and welcome to Week 11's mini lecture series. We have three mini lectures this week. The first one, this one, is 1920s and consumer culture. Then I'm going to talk about Herbert Hoover for a little while. And we'll conclude with what I've titled Red Scare, Red Summer. After all the chaos and carnage of last week's examination into the Great War and the global flu pandemic, I could really use a drink. I mean, the world got through a major war and a concurrent pandemic, and millions of people lie dead. It's a dark, dark era in the history of the 20th century. But there's a bit of a problem with needing a post-war drink in the United States after the Great War, and that's prohibition. The constitutional prohibition of alcohol sales and consumption in the United States. As we discussed a few weeks ago, the temperance movement in the United States pushed for reducing or eliminating alcohol sales and consumption, and in 1920, the Volstead Act became law through constitutional amendment. Tucked in between the provision for the direct election of senators and women's suffrage, prohibition banned the sale of consumption of alcohol in the United States. But it turns out that human beings really like their mind-altering substances, especially when between 30 and 100 million of their fellow human beings have just perished. Prohibition was a massive failure of a, quote, noble experiment, and led to an increase in organized crime, but also a tacit acceptance of violating a constitutional amendment by much of the population. Overall alcohol consumption went down, but it went underground into covert drinking establishments known as speakeasies and to homebrew operations known as bathtub distilleries. Prohibition had a class component as well, with the wealthy preparing to and hoarding liquor for the upcoming dry spell, while the poor drank lower quality alcohol but were also the targets of enforcement actions. By 1925, between 30 and 100,000 illicit speakeasies operated in New York City alone. Physicians could prescribe exemptions for medicinal liquor, and frequently did so. What was called bathtub gin, laced with impurities and other forms of alcohol, often drove people blind and nutsy, and killed more than a few. In Butte, Montana, a woman was arrested numerous times for running illegal distilleries. The judge knew her by name from her routine appearances in front of his bench. An estimated 80% of senators and representatives probably drank illicitly during Prohibition. Even President Warren G. Harding moved his illegal supply into the White House after his inauguration. Law enforcement frequently targeted illegal distilleries, speakeasies, and smugglers, but there's always good money to be made in tickling society's neurons. Organized crime capitalized on peddling illegal alcohol and made a lot of money doing so. Gangsters such as Al Capone were able to expand their criminal empires with the money made on bootlegging. Prohibition also contributed to shifting gender roles and ideas of race. Before Prohibition, drinking culture was above ground and homosocial. Men went to bars together and not with women. With the advent of the speakeasy and illicit liquor, men and women now drank together, partners in crime. Additionally, black artists and musicians often played for speakeasy audiences, often hired by the same mobsters who ran the speakeasies. Perhaps The two most iconic trends to come out of the 1920s were deeply tied with changing ideas about gender and race: the flapper movement and jazz. The flapper movement was a women's fashion and social movement that challenged most ideas of gender roles. Gone were the separate domestic spheres of the Victorian age, and gone were the respectability politics of the suffragists and the new women. Flappers bobbed their hair into short haircuts, smoked cigarettes, drank bootlegged liquor in speakeasies, danced the Charleston, and listened to black musicians play jazz. They crossed the Atlantic and traveled in Europe. The twin crises of the Great War and pandemic influenza had shown young people that life was short and could go badly at any moment, so they may as well enjoy the good times. Prohibition encouraged further transcendence of boundaries, as many flappers saw the moral proclamations of temperance activists ring hollow against the widespread underground drinking culture. Flappers also came out of urbanization and women's labor in the cities. Many young women who worked in the cities and earned their own wage therefore had disposable income. As a young female wage earner, they could now control their income and financial disposition, and could choose how to spend their money. The second iconic cultural movement to come out of the 1920s was jazz. Jazz music really originated in New Orleans, drawing on African musical traditions and using European instruments such as the saxophone and piano. New Orleans had been a cosmopolitan city since its inception, with a strong black artistic and musical tradition. Jazz music emphasized improvisation while drawing on Creole, ragtime, and the blues musical traditions. And jazz combined with speakeasy culture. Both were a bit transcendent and on the fringes of legality, morality, and acceptability. The speakeasy owners, often tied to organized crime, wanted cheap entertainment for their clubs, while the black musician faced intense segregation in where they could play and how they would be paid. In effect, the illicit spaces of the speakeasy allowed for African American jazz musicians to perform for white audiences. Jazz music is perhaps the most iconic of American musical tradition, and its rise came from African musical tradition, organized crime, illicit drinking, and the transgression of social boundaries between black and white and men and women. A major driver of the American economic machine was the automobile industry. I'm not going to go into the Ford Motor Company's mass production operations or Henry Ford's construction of the assembly line or anti-Semitism and weird affinity for Hitler in this section, because that's all been done. We never really get to hear about the weird proclivities of the Studebaker brothers, after all, so I may as well ignore Henry Ford as well. Instead, think about what a culture needs to do to transform into an automobile culture, and where those shifts occur. I'm just going to touch briefly on a few of them. First, a car isn't much use without a road to drive upon. Horses and other draft animals are effectively all-terrain vehicles with four-hoof drive. Sure, wagons need some surfacing of the ground to move more effectively, but even then, a dirt road is often just fine. Automobiles changed that. Whether it was the damage that tires did to old roads, or the damage done to shocks and occupants of the automobile, drivers began demanding better roads, which meant the government had to spend money to pave them, and add things like stop signs and intersections, and create and codify rules of the road and other regulations and stuff like that. And this led to the formation of groups like AAA, the American Automobile Association, which lobbied for road improvements but also provided deals and benefits to their members and was a form of insurance. Cars also need certain things to function regularly, like stopping at gas stations. So think about the cultural geography of a town or state before automobiles. And then think about the distribution and expansion of gas stations and the changes of the geography due to the fossil fuel needs of cars. Where does this make cars concentrate? What else springs up near gas stations? Cars also collapse distance. To walk 25 miles can be an all-day affair, depending on the terrain. Taking a horse might cut the time in half, or down to a few hours. But riding in a car can cut that distance to be a time of an hour or two, if not less. People can start living and working at a greater distance, leading to the rise of suburbs and commuter communities and stuff like that. But we also get the rise of automobile tourism. I mean, we first get cars allowed into Yellowstone National Park in 1916, but they conflicted with older modes of tourism, as they often got stuck or came into conflict with horse users. And this forced Yellowstone Park to pave its road to accommodate for the new form of traffic. We also get the rise of stuff like roadside motels, restaurants, bars, and other related businesses. But we can also think of cars as contributing to a sexual revolution as well. Think about dating and courtship before the advent of the automobile. If two people wanted to consort in secret, it was far more difficult. Chances are the relationship was between people whose families knew of one another. But with a car, young people could get away from the strictures and surveillance of family courtship through mobility and privacy. In many early cars, the back seat was also called the rumble seat, and that was not just because the motor vibrated while you were driving. Finally, cars furthered consumer culture. Not only did people buy stuff for their cars, but their cars got them places to buy more stuff. Before the automobile, many people shopped via mail order through companies such as Sears Roebuck. As the US urbanized and automobilized, new forms of consumption could happen. People could travel farther and faster to department stores and see a greater selection of manufactured goods for purchase. During the booming economy of the 1920s, more people bought more stuff, which means it's now a great time to talk about structural issues in the economy. So, if you'll recall from our first discussion of structural issues in the economy from a few weeks ago, the U.S. industrial economy was an amazingly productive system. Before World War I, the U.S. and Germany were effectively competing in manufacturing capacity. But given the state of Germany's economy after the Great War, the U.S.'s manufacturing capacity surged in the 1920s. The pre-existing condition of overproduction still lingered in the economy, and its twinned malady of underconsumption persisted as well. However, the American economy gained strength in the early 1920s. Businesses boomed, and the peace after the Great War, following a brief post-war recession, really inspired consumer confidence. Wartime armaments manufacturing retooled back to consumer manufacturers and started cranking out stuff on an even larger scale. The old solution of the open door policy had worked for a while. U.S. commercial access to foreign markets was still expanding, especially in Latin America through the occasional U.S. military intervention. But Asian markets were becoming more restrictive. An ascendant and modernizing Japanese empire resisted trade with the US, and China was having a really fun time with its political experiments in republicanism, nationalism, kleptocracy, and rule by warlord, driving its capacity to purchase American manufacturers way down. So, a new solution for the underconsumption problem developed, and it came out of the confidence and exuberance of the booming American economy. The extension of consumer credit, or purchasing on margin and payment plans. Manufacturers, whether of big ticket items such as cars and refrigerators, or smaller consumer purchases, began extending lines of credit on a wide scale. And the amorphous American consumer began purchasing widely with money that they planned to have in the future to pay off their debts. This massive expansion of credit drove the American economy throughout the 1920s, and in a bit of a spoiler alert, it would not end well. Alright, I think that's it for this mini lecture, and next up I'm going to talk about Herbert Hoover for a while.